Okay.
I'm back.
Great. Okay. Let's begin then.
Brilliant.
Let me
We've got
just.
quorum, yeah?
Okay. Let's start. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon for those the other side of the Atlantic, and good morning for those in Latin America. We have the second of our webinars on research communication. Carolina Kern is going to be talking to us about policy briefs. Carolina is based in Nairobi, so for those of you in Africa, if you want to get in touch with her afterwards, I think it'll be easy for at least time differences, and those who are in Nairobi might find it even easier. Carolina will follow similar approach as Jeff followed last 2 weeks. Well, actually, before the new year. She'll give a presentation with a few moments when you can ask her some questions. If you are on the Google Hangout and you'd like to ask a question, you can either wait for the right time and unmute yourselves and ask the question, or ask your question on the group chat, and I will give you time to ask it yourselves. If you are on YouTube, Andrea and I will be monitoring it. So just ask your question there. You can ask it in Spanish or in English. We'll then ask it to, we'll pass it along to Carolina in English, and then she'll respond. So we hope you enjoy the presentation. And this will be, of course, is being recorded, so you can watch it again later. And we'll send along also all supporting materials. Carolina, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kike, and thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate that some people are joining at the very end of their day and some at the very beginning. So thanks very much. This is kind of the last time you'll see my face for a little bit until we go to questions. I'm going to open up my presentation now, which I believe you've all received on email prior to this presentation. So let me just do that now. Can everybody see that? Okay. I'm hoping you can. Kike, can you see it? Okay, great. So, welcome to this second session on effective communications run by On Think Tanks for Ella. As Kike said, my name's Carolina and I've been working in the communications sector for over a decade, mainly in the UK and in the East Africa region, which is, as he said, where I am now. I'm based in Nairobi and have been for the last 4 years. Before that, I was in South Sudan working for UNDP. I'll talk a bit more about my background later, but before we kick off, I want to check that everybody can hear me, which it does seem that you can, and to just remind you to mute yourself if you're not talking. We had some problems before with kind of nasty feedback coming through from echoes and things like that. So please mute yourself while you're not talking, but do feel free to join in during the questions and discussion session a bit later. I'd like to, as I said, I'd like to make this, there will be discussion, I'd like to make it as interactive as possible. If you're watching using Google Hangouts, you can comment or ask a question using the chat panel. If you're watching via YouTube, you should do it by leaving a comment. Kike and Andrea, as Kike said, are kindly helping to bring those questions together in case I miss them. Okay, so let's kick off because we've got quite a bit to cover. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break this session down into sort of 5 sections. The first is an explanation of what policy briefs are, why they're important. We'll also look at a few samples of good and bad policy briefs in that session, following the discussion that was posted on the Ella platform earlier this week. Part 2 will be an overview of I guess, your audience, who reads them. Also, we'll have a look at the different organizations that produce them. And as part of this session, we'll also start to look at developing the content of a policy brief, including how to structure your line of argument. Now, the reason why I lump developing your content into part 2 is that it's very, very tied to your audience. So you'll understand why that section looks the way it does when we get to it. Part 3, I'll guide you through the key elements of a policy brief: executive summaries, recommendations, conclusions, as well as explaining some of the tricks that you can use to help highlight your key arguments. And this is largely around design, using text boxes, using graphs, using photos. I'll end in part 4 by talking a little bit about the importance of having a good dissemination strategy for your papers. Though I won't dwell too much on this, because I really want to focus on ensuring that everybody gets some solid knowledge on actually how to produce a policy brief. And finally, as was mentioned in the last session, I think many of you attended it, which is great, these webinars are all about getting you to produce concrete outputs using the research that you've been working on. So to put this session into practice, I'll be giving you some homework, which is to produce your very own policy brief drawn from the regional evidence papers that you've all been working on for some months. And I think Andrea has produced a suggested structure that you can follow as part of this, which we're happy to send out after this presentation. Okay, the basics. I have to say that I'm a very old school communications person. I like things written down and printed out. Don't get me wrong, I do use media, social media a fair bit, and I'm fascinated by the process of developing things like infographics. So I'm certainly a big fan of Jeff's, who ran the last session last year. But I do think it's hard to beat a meaty, punchy, well put together policy brief that tells a good story. The reason for this is that because even though people are accessing information differently, and the way that we access information is changing, policymakers are old school like me. The short 2, 4, maximum 8-pager is just part of the policy process. It's part of the business of decision making, and that's not going to be replaced with a tweet, although obviously Twitter can help disseminate those briefs. Just to give you a bit of a background on my experience, I've moved between communications and policy roles for a variety of organizations over the years. So I'm quite well placed in that I've been a producer and a receiver of policy briefs. So when I worked in London at ODI, I spent many, many years working within their humanitarian section to draw key messages and recommendations from their excellent but very dense reports. So in that role, I was very much a producer of policy briefs. But I've subsequently worked for in policy roles, both in South Sudan and in Nairobi, where I've been very much the target audience for these briefs. So I think this gives me a good background and a unique insight into how different users use them and what some of the tricks you could use to employ them. So what are policy briefs and why are they important? To begin with, we need to be really clear about what we mean by a policy brief. Because if you look online, you're going to find lots of things that call themselves policy briefs or policy notes or policy briefings. Some are pages and pages and pages long. I was looking around this afternoon, in fact, and found something that called itself a policy brief that was 78 pages. So to be crystal clear, a policy brief is a concise, standalone document that focuses on a particular issue requiring policy attention. It is not a long report. What do I mean by concise? I mean 2 pages minimum, 8 pages at the absolute maximum, and that includes your references. My own preference is the 4-page format, but in terms of, I understand that people need a bit of scope to work within, so between 2 and 8 pages is what it should be looking like. What do I mean by standalone? I mean, it doesn't need you to reference any other documents. So please don't write a 4-page brief and then include 8 pages of annexes, something that I've also seen done before. This doesn't mean that you can't use a long report and synthesize it. The best briefs actually do that, but you shouldn't have to look at that report in order for the policy brief to be understood. More specifically, I guess, a policy brief explains and conveys the urgency of an issue, and often does this by clearly defining the problem and why it needs to change, which is something I've seen you've been doing in your regional evidence papers, two of which I've read. A policy brief is understandable without additional reading or specialized knowledge. I'd caveat that with unless that knowledge can be assumed for the particular audience you're writing for. This is quite common in health policy briefs. But in general, it should be understandable to a generalist rather than a specialist in the subject. A policy brief should present policy recommendations, or at least implications, and provide entry points in order to prompt change. What I mean by entry points is to articulate a way in which your recommendations might be taken forward. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about that in a later section. And finally, a policy gives evidence to support your recommendations. Of course, you can point your reader to additional resources, and this could be the longer report, a relevant working paper that forms part of your research, or even work done by other organizations that support the work that you're doing. Does anybody have any questions at this stage? I mean, that's a very kind of short intro session, but okay. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll continue.
Carolina, if there are any questions in the Google, sorry, in the YouTube, I'll pass them along. So I might interrupt you in a minute or so because there's a delay in YouTube.
Okay, and are you, okay, that's perfect. That would be great. That's why I flipped out of this screen. So yeah, I won't do that again then. Great. Okay. So in terms of why they are important, public policy research, I think, is about prompting change. It might be a change in the way we understand a problem or address it, and it's ultimately about improving public policy outcomes. In fact, I'd go so far as to argue that research is basically unfinished or incomplete unless the findings are distilled and applied in some way. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to aim to fundamentally change policy with every piece of work you do, but it does mean it needs to be part of your thinking through the research process and in the process of writing it up. One of the things that I advise researchers or practitioners that I've worked with in different UN agencies to do when they're writing is to keep asking yourself, why am I doing this? What do I want to happen at the end of this research or this intervention? There is, however, a research policy divide. Put differently, publishing research doesn't lead to its use in practice. Excuse me, sorry, there's Hello? Sorry, Kike?
Yes? Is everything okay?
Yeah, sorry, my computer seemed to have frozen. Let me go back.
We can see it fine.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that.
There is a question from YouTube you might want to incorporate into your presentation, which is, in case one wants to write a brief before the bigger report is published, can one refer to it?
Yes, definitely. And there are quite a few examples of policy briefs that are produced in the middle, for example, of a big five-year longitudinal study, for example, that refer to reports that are forthcoming or perhaps working papers that have been produced in the interim. So that's definitely something that you can do. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, I believe. So, as I started mentioning before, I've worked for UN agencies and for donors and for partner governments. I feel that the policy brief is one of the most important communications outputs produced by think tanks and research institutes. If done properly and disseminated well, they're the kind of things that are quoted in diplomatic cables, that are put into briefings for decision makers. In other words, civil servants are not just pulling ideas out of thin air. But like I said, there's a research policy divide. What do I mean by this? Well, to be honest, researchers and policymakers are completely different animals. They have divergent needs and pressures regarding information usage. So researchers like to focus on rigorous studies. They often wrap their conclusions in caveats. Policymakers, on the other hand, just need enough information to make a case. But they need the information to be quite clear, and they need to be, in order to be very clear about what they're recommending. Policymakers and researchers are different in terms of their level of knowledge about a subject. So researchers are often experts in the field, while policymakers are generalists and have diverse knowledge about a range of issues. So this affects the way that specialist information might be communicated. And we'll talk about this a little bit when we come to the importance of knowing your audience. Researchers and policymakers are different because they have different time horizons. Researchers often need a long time to complete their research, and rightfully so. In order for it to be a rigorous piece of research, you want to take your time over it. You need to develop a solid methodology. You need to be able to conduct it. But policymakers tend to need to make decisions quickly and in accordance to the political agenda. And finally, the reason for the research and policy divide is that evidence or research isn't the only thing that influences policy. I won't focus too much on this diagram, but it's a good illustration of some of the things that affect decision making, some of which are competing, actually. So just to finish off on this section about why policy briefs are important, given this divide and the competing pressures on decision makers, what policy briefs can do is act as a bridge by translating research for the intended policy audience. It's pretty crucial, actually. Organizations like think tanks have started to do a very good job of that translation. But there's some work to be done yet to get it quite right. They can help and through that they can help make the evidence more understandable outside their own academic environment or specialist environment, and therefore more usable and likely to be applied. So that's the end of the kind of first intro session. Again, are there any questions on that? Okay. Let's jump in then and have a look at some different types of policy briefs, different kinds of policy briefs. There are two ways that you can approach a policy brief, or in which a policy brief can kind of be developed. The first is the objective or synthesis tool. It's the kind of thing that ODI and IDS and think tanks like that do very well. The second one is an advocacy tool. Now, I think that having read some of your REPs, you'll be opting for the first one of these, the objective policy brief. But I'd quickly like to go through the difference between these two so that you're aware of them, particularly when you're doing your own research online and you come across a policy brief that looks a bit different to what I've described. So the ODI brief on rising food prices, it's called Rising Food Prices Cause for Concern, in case you want to have a look at it after this webinar. This is a good example of an objective brief. It presents the problems caused by rising food prices and what policymakers might do to respond. It's got a few options. It's not massively prescriptive, but it gives some options to policymakers. The one on the right, the advocacy brief, which was actually produced by FAO, which is unusual actually, because the UN tends to shy away from direct advocacy briefs, but it's a good example, so I've picked it up here. This deals with farmer field schools and is an example of a good piece of advocacy that urges the Ugandan government to adopt a specific approach. There aren't options. They don't think that you might want to do this. They say that you do want, that you should do this. What I sometimes see with these sorts of tools is that these sorts of briefs might be private. They might not be published online. It might be something that's developed for a specific organization, but that isn't kind of disseminated broadly because of the audience that you're trying to target. Obviously, in terms of the types of people that produce it, it's advocacy groups, as you'd expect, but NGOs often produce these sorts of briefs, and they're often targeted at governments or UN agencies, which is why I mentioned that it was odd that FAO was the one that produced this. For your reference, here's a table outlining the two different types of briefs. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because, as I said, we're going to be focusing on a policy brief as a synthesis or objective tool, but it's just there for you to have a look at how the objectives differ, how the messaging might be a bit different, what the usual audience is, and that sort of thing. One thing that I would like to point out, and it came up in my discussions with Kike in developing this training, is that the objective policy brief can be slightly more informative than prescriptive. So often researchers worry that they are being asked to recommend things that the data doesn't necessarily support and that they have to kind of put their name on. Actually, a policy brief can be developed to, sorry about that, that's my daughter crying in the background, that can be developed to just put a new piece of information on the agenda. So it doesn't necessarily have to have very punchy recommendations. It can be more informative in nature. I'd like to now invite us to have a bit of a discussion. Now, as you may have seen, Andrea posted a couple of questions related to 3 different policy briefs on the Ella platform earlier this week. Just to jog your memory, these were the 3 briefs that I provided, and I asked you to have a look at them, have a look at the structure and the content, and what things could be done to improve the brief. Is there anybody that wants to, who didn't get a chance to comment, who wants to comment now on any of those briefs, if you did manage to read them? Okay, that's fine. I did get an interesting set of comments from Alemu in Ethiopia. And I liked it because, number one, his answer was very comprehensive, which is great. He picked out some of the critical points I was hoping you would, namely with regards to the length of each of the briefs. The one on the right on mental health is extremely long. Also with regards to different elements that can be used to highlight data and visuals. So, for example, the one on the far on the left, published by IDS, doesn't use any photos or graphs, although it does use some interesting pull-out quotes and some text boxes, which we'll discuss later on. I was interested to also from him to read that that he had an issue with the fact that the IDS brief didn't include any citations. One thing that I would say is that when it comes to policy briefs, and particularly when you're synthesizing a bigger report, you don't need to fill your policy brief with referencing. Obviously, don't pass things off as your own work. If it is a quote from a different piece of work, do reference it. But if you're summarizing a larger report that includes citations, you don't need to fill it with footnotes and references. So just to very, very quickly pull out, just go one by one and pull out the elements of these briefs that are worth noting. In the IDS brief, again on the left, the red one, I think the executive summary, or the summary, it's sometimes called a summary box, is excellent. I think the headings are engaging. It kind of tells you very quickly, if you skimmed it, it would give you a good idea of what's going to be contained in the brief. There's good use of pull-out quotes and text boxes, as I said before, and there's a really good set of recommendations at the back. Definitely an example here of a synthesizing or objective brief rather than an advocacy brief, which is good because that's what we'll be using for your papers. The only thing I think, and again as Alemu noted, was that there could be better use of pictures or perhaps an infographic if it were appropriate, although not every policy brief needs to include those. If it's not appropriate, don't kind of try and push the point. And in the recommendations, there could be, in my view, they could go slightly further in articulating how those recommendations might be put into place. But given that it's an objective brief, it's a very good example, and one that you should, that I would recommend that you print out and look at as you develop your own policy papers. The National Centre for Agricultural Economics in India, their policy brief. I noted that Alemu likes this one a lot, which is great. I think I agree with him that it includes some very good information. What I would say for this one is that it's very, very text heavy, and we'll look at this later, how you can use design elements such as summary boxes and pictures and pull quotes to break up a piece of text and kind of make it less daunting, but also to highlight the key information that you want. In this particular brief, even the conclusions were buried in a very, very heavy and long paragraph. I'd also say, arguably, and on the following pages, if you have a look at the full version of this brief, there are too many tables used. But I do like, the way that some of the evidence is presented. There are also possibly slightly too many acronyms in there as well. And finally, the WHO and EU mental health brief. As you can probably tell, this was the brief that I wanted you to say was the worst. It does use some interesting design elements like text boxes and sidebars, but the crucial point is that it's just too long. The conclusion is very weak. It's a one sentence long. It's quite repetitive in parts, and its recommendations are just not very strong. They're a bit flimsy. So yeah, have a look at those if you haven't already, or if you didn't get a chance to as part of that discussion. As I said, one of the things that I like to do is have a good version of a policy brief next to me when I'm writing a new one, because it just reminds me of what of the kinds of things I can do to make it flow better. Okay, let's move on to the audiences of a policy brief, who writes them, and then get on to the more important stuff, which is to develop the content for one. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of sound coming in. Kike, was there a question?
No, I was just unmuting someone, but I want to ask a quick question. So clearly the third policy brief has a cover page. Is this definitely a no-no?
In general, I advise against cover pages because, well, number one, it makes the user have to do something to engage in it, i.e. turn the page. But also, it's I just don't think that it's necessary. It also makes it look too much like a report to me. Policy briefs have got a particular look and feel. And even though the word policy brief is on that one, that doesn't immediately look like one to me. So I would advise strongly against including cover pages unless you really need to, unless that's kind of the template that's been developed as part of your organization. Okay. So the content. Who reads policy briefs, who writes them, and what content goes into them. Who reads them? To be completely honest, the people who read policy briefs are the people on your dissemination list. It's really important to take time to develop a good mailing list or an invite list to communicate your message. That's kind of communications 101. Frustratingly, though, even though this sounds quite obvious, the development of a mailing list often gets done when the brief's already been produced. So when the finished product is there and you're kind of looking to get it out there. Even though you tend to know who your target audience is, or at least the kind of vague organization that you're targeting, right at the beginning. So I would really recommend that as you go through, as you do your research, as you meet with people, as you start to kind of formulate, recommendations and things like that, that you start just throwing those contacts into an Excel list so that you can actually use them. Obviously, your organization probably produces policy briefs and reports and might have a more generic mailing list. But I think that in terms of getting your message across and getting it to be used, you really have to get it into the right hands. Ideally, the kinds of people that tend to read policy briefs are obviously decision makers, but note that this isn't a homogenous group. There's different types of decision makers at different levels: ministers, bureaucrats, advisors, people in official opposition, practitioners, read policy briefs, depending on who produces them. Civil society is using them because they're often needing evidence to push their own agenda. Your peers, of course, will look at them, although this is less of a target audience and more of, unless you're trying to get them to come on board with your views. Advocacy groups and, importantly, the media. The media is quite important, although I won't go into kind of media strategies and things like that. But one thing I would say is that if the media picks up on your policy brief, your key messages are much likely to get a wider audience and be bumped up in terms of profile. I don't know how many times when I was working for a donor, when I was working for AusAid, the Australian version of DFID, the direction of our work was kind of sent in a particular direction because there was some media story that then required us to react, and that can be obviously because of an event, but sometimes it is because a sort of quite important landmark report is published. As I said, in terms of policymakers, they're not a homogenous group. The other thing to determine is the level. You might be pitching it at national or subnational people. And in terms of their level and where you're pitching it, it will depend on how you communicate information and the particular recommendations you might choose to highlight. Are there any questions on that? Because I know that you've been doing some work. In fact, I will open to questions now. I know that you've been doing some work in the development of your REPs on your audiences, including doing some stakeholder mapping. So maybe one or two of you, if you don't mind, may take me through your audience. So who have you determined with your REPs is being targeted? How do they perceive the issue? Are they aware of it? Or how much do they know about it if they do? And if they are aware of it, are they open to change and the changes that you might be recommending? So let's just start actually with who are you targeting and how do they perceive the issue? If there's anybody that's gone through this process and would be willing to speak and participate, that would be great.
Is anybody in the Google Hangout willing to respond to Carolina?
So this is Tim from Tekimeo.
Mm-hmm.
So yes. This is Tim from Tekimeo. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So so much like for us, most of our people that we target for policy briefs. Well, so we have policymakers, so we have government bureaucrats. So ideally, they may be aware of the general issue that we are talking about, but they may not be aware of the specific evidence that we are presenting to them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
sorry, go on.
Yeah. So in our case, so we are looking at collective land issues, and so there's a general debate that is going on. So one of the things that we want to do is to use the evidence that we have collected to kind of help them shape the policy in a better way. So the current thing is the government wants to protect community land, but then the debate is on the how are we going to protect community land. So they are aware about the issue. There's already discussion going on, but then what we want to do is to provide evidence that shapes the how and kind of provides evidence or information on what works, what probably is not working, how are the beneficiaries going to perceive it. So like in our case, we want to make sure that it's very brief, very focused, and clearly highlighting the evidence and the messages are kind of to the point.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to push you a little bit on this because that's great, and it sounds like quite an interesting project. In terms of the changes that you might be suggesting, the recommendations that you might be suggesting to the government, is your perception that they would be resistant to these recommendations, or are they largely kind of on board with the fact that protecting community land is important and open to new ways of doing that?
I think they're going to be resistant because there is a lot of interest, not just from different groups. So we have, because the land is not idle. So, for example, you have, on one hand, the government itself would have a stake in the sense that if the land is clearly belongs to somebody, if the government wants to do a project on it, they would have to go and negotiate. So the government has interest, community have interest, bureaucrats have interest in terms of controlling large resources. Politicians have interest because for us it has always been a bait in terms of getting vote. So you have different, we expect that they're not going to jump on board. So there has to be a lot of convincing to kind of get them to accept our message and use that message to shape the policy.
And within those that set of stakeholders that you mentioned, that's quite comprehensive, is there anybody that is on your side? That,
oh yes.
Wouldn't be resistant? I mean,
yes,
within
yes.
government, not just obviously community people.
Yes, so we have some people who are speaking with the same voice as us. So we have some civil society organizations that have been working with communities on land issues. They are speaking the same language as us. Even amongst, for example, the political divide, you have people who strongly support what you're trying to say. We have people also in government, different departments. So, for example, departments in environment, natural conservation, and wildlife are clearly on board with what you're saying. Okay. But probably that may not sit well with the Ministry of Lands.
Well, we'll talk a bit offline about this maybe, but one of the things that I tend to find that works well is to target a specific, is to try and kind of break down who you're targeting. And if you do have varying levels of resistance, you might be, you might be emphasizing certain elements of your brief a bit differently. But I'm just aware of the time, so I'm actually just going to close that bit of discussion with just one intervention. I hope that that's okay. But obviously, if people have got comments, I'm happy to receive them over email or over the group chat. So I'm going to go back to my slides now. I hope that's okay. Here we go. Okay, so that's I think a good session on audiences, and I know that you've already been doing quite a bit of work on that, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. In terms of who writes policy briefs, very quick bulleted list of the kinds of organisations that do it. Obviously, think tanks, academic institutions, NGOs, specialist agencies, that kind of thing. There's quite a variety there, and you'll note that they take one of the two approaches. So objective briefs, usually done by think tanks and academic institutions, more advocacy type briefs done by the NGOs, political parties, that sort of thing. So now on to the good stuff. How the heck do you develop the content for your brief? First, and before I kind of take you through this this process slide, some very, very practical tips that I've found is to start with a blank piece of paper. That sounds really stupid, But what I mean by that is don't try and cut down your REPs from 40 pages down to 4 pages by editing. The text that you end up with by doing that will mean nothing. Obviously, you're going to draw heavily on those papers, and you're probably going to lift whole sentences and maybe paragraphs from them, but don't edit it down. You need to take a step back and see your policy brief as a slightly different sort of product. Linked to the blank piece of paper comment, don't do any formatting and fancy design when you're drafting. I find that people try to do that, and they're trying to pull out quotes and little text boxes. Don't do it. Just draft the main components of your brief and leave the sort of text boxes and pictures to the end. Okay? Right, so to take you through this process diagram, the first thing I do when developing a policy brief is to identify the purpose and overarching message. What do you want the target audience to take action on? What particular action do you want them to take? Maybe you want to emphasize that no action should be taken, and maybe you're calling attention to a new problem or a new debate. But really be very clear about what the purpose of your brief is, and write it down, and maybe just keep it print it out, keep it in bold in front of you as you write that brief. The second thing that I do, once I'm very clear about what my objective is to determine the recommendations and implications. Now, this works well if you've got a large report that you've worked on. You might be, the kinds of recommendations I'm talking about is that you might be describing a gap in implementation of a particular policy. You might be suggesting that more resources should be directed to a particular sector. You might even be wanting to address a lack of consensus about the solutions to a defined problem. So be very clear about what policy recommendations or implications you're trying to convey. And it's important to do this second. It seems like that should be done last, but basically everything that you do in the paper should be linked to, first, your overarching objective, and second, should be in some way arguing for the recommendation that you're going to leave them with. The third thing that I do when I either write policy briefs myself or help researchers do it is to construct a logical line of argument for making these particular recommendations. What do I mean by this? You need to, the line of argument is basically the thought pattern you've used to take a specific point and try and convince somebody of it. So for me, a logical line of argument tends to start by giving a bit of necessary background, but not a lot, articulating the problem, explaining what has caused the problem, explaining what effects they have had on people, and finally providing options for dealing with the problem. That's a line of argument. So problems, effects, causes, possible solutions. The food prices brief that I highlighted at the beginning as a good objective brief is a good example of a brief that does that well. Articulates the problems, what the effects it's had, and what the possible solutions are. A slightly different way of doing this is, especially if you're relying on the results of a pilot intervention, might be that you state the problem, you explain and describe the intervention made, and then you provide some policy implications or recommendations for maybe scaling up or scaling down or changing the particular intervention. Then, if appropriate, and this is why this is grayed out a little bit, because sometimes it isn't appropriate, especially for synthesizing or objective briefs, you might want to take your recommendations a bit further by identifying 1 or 2 entry points for the message. And what I mean by that is how recommendations might be taken forward. So if you're saying that X, Y, and Z needs to be done, how would X, Y, and Z be achieved? And there'll be a very clear example of entry points when we actually look at some examples of the different sections. So forgive me for using that buzzword a few times and not describing it, but you'll see what I mean later. A few additional practical points, and I think, again, the IDS brief on safety nets does this well. Make sure that you structure your text in a logical manner. Don't force the reader to work out what you're trying to say. What I find is that this can be achieved by keeping paragraphs very short, restrict them to a single idea. If you look at World Bank reports, they do this quite well. They bold the first sentence of a paragraph to reinforce this. Reread each paragraph and ask yourself, so what? If it's not obvious what you're saying, delete it or rewrite it. So do, as I said, make your language clear, simple, and easy to understand, and avoid academic terms and jargon. This goes back to the audience section. You really need to write for the audience that you're trying to target, and they are, in general, not specialists. Very quickly, researchers are often comfortable writing in a particular way, and that's long scholarly papers that use very specific language, that have a very specific structure. As I said before, in order to bridge this divide between research and policy, you have to become a translator. You have to unpack key parts of your research and make it accessible. This means an emphasis on communication, which is not the same as just providing information. If providing information was all it took to change what people do or to change policy, far fewer people would smoke or eat fast food. You need to tell a story. In terms of just unpacking what I mean by communication, it goes back to what Jeff talked about in the session before Christmas. It's namely that you need to understand what your users' needs are and what their perceptions are, so a big focus on audience. Find and refine your messages, and then tell a story to communicate your message and make it sticky. You certainly don't need a comms department to do this, but a communications focus is very important. So do sort of think about those three questions as you're developing your brief. Do I understand who I'm writing for? Have I picked out the key messages in my research? Would my mum understand it, basically, is what I usually think about when I'm refining messages. And that makes me take all the technical terms out. It makes me stop assuming that there is knowledge there. And finally, to tell a story. Are there any questions at this point?
Carolina, there's a question from YouTube relating to your bullet point slide. Mm-hmm. And it asks, what are the implications you are referring to in bullet point 2? Are they implications of the problem, or are they implications of not addressing the problem?
Sorry, is this the slide, the
slide,
process
yes.
slide?
Yes, determine key policy recommendations implications.
So the policy recommendations or implications are the recommendations that you're making, not the implications that come from the problem. Have I understood that correctly? Could you repeat the question?
What are the implications of that you referred to in bullet point 2? Are they implications of the problem or implications of not addressing the problem?
It's usually, recommendations and implications are often used interchangeably. These are the recommendations that you will suggest as part of your research. Sometimes, yes, the implications are an outline of what will happen if no action is taken. But in general, I like sort of I would push you all to avoid just putting implications, because that just states things like, well, this problem is there and this is kind of what's happening. I'd recommend that you go further and state recommendations. So sorry about the structure of that slide, but yeah, I would recommend not just stating the problems, sorry, the outcomes of what the problems are. Any other questions? Okay. So the structure of a policy brief. Sorry. I'm going to go through what policy briefs that I've seen to have an impact have been structured like. There are a few sections that really must be included, regardless of what they're called, whether they're a summary box or an executive summary or implications or recommendations, but they really must be included in each and every policy brief. And then I'll go through some of the elements that help to highlight your key messages. So the structure. So to remind you, a policy brief should be no less than 2 pages, no more than 8 pages. Down below in the note, you can see what that translates to in words, in number of words. So please don't write a 8-page brief that's in 0.9 font. That's generally the number of words that you should be looking at. What I tend to say is that this structure is indicative. There are some elements of this that can be dropped, and but this is the structure that has been used for many years at ODI. Just for your information, again, I know I've said this, Andrea has put together a guiding structure to help you turn your REPs into policy briefs, and you might want to refer to those. Some of her headings are slightly differently labeled to mine, but they're very similar sections. This nevertheless gives you a good idea of what the weighting is for each of those. So you can see very clearly that your methodology should not be 30% of your policy paper. It should be a very small section, a few sentences at most. So I'm going to go through each element individually and give examples. Again, I'm conscious at the time and that everyone's been very patient and that it hasn't been as interactive as I would have wanted. But let me go through this, and at the end we can take a few questions.
Sorry, can I just say one thing?
Mm-hmm.
As Karina was saying, this is an indication. We, the example I've developed is for those of you who want inspiration, but the structure of your policy brief depends on you. I know most of you already have special ways that special structures that you use on your own communication. So this is an indication, these are recommendations, but you are free to decide what would be the best way to reach your audiences. These are best practice and best examples, the same as the structure that I would share with you, but you are not, we're not forcing you, or we don't want you to use the same structure as we recommend. It's free for you to decide what would be the best way based on your audiences and the recommendations that we're giving you. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So, the executive summary or executive statement, sometimes it's called a summary box, depending on how your template has been put together. it should include all standard elements of a policy brief. What I mean by that is that it should include, if I just skip back one slide, a very quick introduction or background. You may include one line on the methodology, although the methodology can be excluded altogether, as I'll show you a bit later when we get to that section. You should put a few lines about your results and conclusions, and you should include some of the implications that come from those results and conclusions. Obviously, don't include references and useful documents in that summary or in that summary box, but it should include all components of the policy brief in that short executive summary. One pet peeve: please don't say this policy brief summarizes a larger report and then leave it at that. I've seen a few briefs that just talk about the fact that it's summarizing a larger report and don't give anything further. That's a lazy way to do things. Do pull out the key messages, the key findings of your research in that box. The emphasis of that box is to capture attention. It appears on the first page, so it's very important. You could include an aim or a problem description in that summary box. I've seen that done, and it's very useful. And it's usually written last. So when you've got your blank piece of paper in front of you, don't start writing your executive summary. It's usually much easier to write it at the end. Here's an example, a very quick example of an introduction that was written in a policy brief produced by the University of Tunis. I'll let you look at that in more depth if you want to after this. What I like about this is that it very quickly conveys the urgency of the issue and gives clear recommendations. The introduction, moving on from the summary box, the executive summary, your introduction is designed to capture the attention of the reader. Again, it explains the urgency of the issue, and the policy brief on rising food prices is quite a good example of that. Creates curiosity about the rest of your brief, and might also outline the structure of the rest of the brief. Although if you've used subheadings well, you don't need to do that in too much depth. Here's an example of a good introduction. As I said, this is an updated version of that food prices brief. It's good at conveying the urgency and pointing the reader to what they should expect in the paper. Sometimes this, as I said before, this section isn't needed. What I would say about policymakers is that they're interested in what you found out and what you recommend. They don't necessarily need to know really in-depth detail about how you gathered the information. So just a few lines will do, and sometimes it's appropriate to leave it out altogether. Definitely, definitely, definitely do not include how many people you interviewed, how the interviews were structured. All that sort of classic methodology speak should not feature in a policy brief. One good example, though, of where methodology was quite important was in a policy brief that I was involved in writing some years ago, which looks at attacks against aid workers. It was good here to talk about how many years of data had been analysed. The size of the data set and the range of indicators observed was quite important, and it gave credibility to the paper because it had never been done before. So in that sense, it was very important. But you can see here, even this methodology has only really been summarized in just a few lines. I know this is going to be bad news for very old school researchers. But yeah, try and condense your methodological description into a couple of sentences. Right, the next section. The results and conclusions. This is a important section because it gives an overview of your findings. It might restate or be structured around your line of argument. It goes through some of the implications of your research, but this isn't the policy recommendation section. This is possibly a 1 to 2 paragraph section at the very end, which kind of summarizes what you've said. So it's different from the section that I'm going to go on to in a minute. It looks a little bit like this, and apologies, that slide is labeled wrong. It should say conclusion samples. You can see here that I've cut this conclusion down to make it fit on this slide, but it gives you an idea of the feel of a conclusion paragraph. Right, the important bit, at least for me. I can't state this enough, but the recommendations and implications section of your policy brief might be the only thing that a policymaker or decision maker reads. So spend time on developing these, make them punchy, make them memorable. Do not kind of suggest slightly vague recommendations. If they're vague, just leave them out. This is what actions you are recommending. Implications and recommendations are a little bit different. For implications, you might be looking at what policy changes or actions do the results point to, which is much less not as strong, sorry, as the recommendations where you're telling them to do something. It's both implications and recommendations, though, are supported by evidence. Both must be actionable, which is why they should not be vague. What I find the key difference is that it's just that they're less direct than recommendations. So implications tend to be policymakers might consider, whereas a recommendation might be would say policymakers should do action X or Y. It's useful to use when advice is not requested or welcome. So where you're kind of where it's where your publication hasn't been requested by a policymaker. With recommendations, you usually need to state precise steps for how the recommendation might be implemented, and that's what I mean by entry points. Now, one thing to note is that while it's important to be specific, the more specific you make your recommendations, the more carefully you need to vet them with their intended audience. So if you're being very, very specific about the exact changes that you want made to an exact law, you need to be you need to do a lot more work on your stakeholder mapping to understand how receptive or resistant that audience would be to that recommendation. Otherwise, even though your steps are precise and your recommendations are direct, it won't have much impact. Here's an example of what I mean by a recommendation. I've actually pulled this from a training done for Johns Hopkins researchers. You can see here, recommendation number 1, promote healthier, excuse the spelling mistake, nutrition in schools. That's what I would say is quite a vague recommendation. how. It could be interpreted as loads of different things. What do you want us to do? Does it mean including a module on nutrition in a health class? Does it mean banning pizza parties at school? What do you want us to do with that? Version 2 is a bit better, but it actually lacks entry points. Like I said, an entry point takes recommendations one step further by being specific about the way you could affect change. It's usually followed by the word by in a recommendation section. So you can see here in recommendation version 3, you've got the same start to the recommendation: promote healthier food choices in school lunches by moving fresh vegetables and lower fat foods closer to the front of the lunch line and removing soda from vending machines. That's a very prescriptive and specific recommendation. Whether you want to be, as I said, whether you want to be as prescriptive and direct as that will depend on your audience and how receptive they are to change. In terms of the references and useful resources section, it's especially useful, this section, when synthesizing information from a lot of different sources. Always cite appropriately, but as I said, if you're summarizing a larger report where you're essentially restating your own research, you don't need to do that. You can include seminal works in the area or working papers that have contributed to that research. It's also a really good opportunity in this section to direct the reader to other resources by the same author or organization. So for your REPs, you could certainly use this references section to direct somebody to the ELA website or your own website, and that would be a good place to do that. One thing to say, as I've said before, it doesn't have to be an exhaustive list. Some policy briefs I've seen include far too many resources as part of the paper. You really need to try and find a way to cut those down. One way that I've found that was quite clever was by putting some of the resources in the sidebar section, but we'll have a look at that in a moment. So now just to the look and feel. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time going through the look and feel, because the nice thing about the look and feel is that you can immediately see what I mean. So it's not so much about content, but about the little tricks you can use to make things visually engaging. The design can help highlight facts and concepts a bit better. They can also convey authority and add sort of tone, a better tone to the piece. So some of the common techniques that are used in very, very good policy briefs are, titles. Don't underestimate the importance of a title. It's going to be the thing that decides whether somebody reads it. So take a bit of time to come up with a good title. The ones that I find work best are short titles, where you then have a stand first, which means a subtitle that sits underneath. Headings are also very important. They help to break up the text. Essentially, all of these elements are just a clever way of telling a bigger story than the space you've got. So there's a few definitions there. Titles, stand first is the one sentence that is under your main title. As it says there, it usually appears directly below the title. Headings, as you saw in the IDS policy brief, they not only give people a very quick idea of what the structure is, but can break up your sections very easily. My suggestion is that you should use more headings than you're used to. So in a policy brief that's 4 pages, you should be looking at using about 6 headings. Just to re-emphasize the importance of good titles, I'm sure that you can all see what's wrong with these titles. They don't really mean very much. Some of them are full of acronyms. In fact, both of them are. Certainly don't asterisk a title. So they should mean something. They should be catchy. They should tell the reader what the brief contains. This is a better example taken from ISS here in Nairobi. It's got kind of a very, you know exactly what the brief is about, and then the stand first explains kind of what the policy brief will cover. Pictures, I don't think I need to restate or talk about this too much, but of course they're worth 1,000 words. They should be bold and vibrant. If your project pictures are dark and dingy or of people having a meeting, do not use them. You should be using bold and vibrant pictures if possible. They also can be used to make the brief much more real or personal. One thing that I would say is that you should respect privacy, especially where children and health-related images are concerned, and take note of copyright. So don't look up stuff on Google Images and steal it. Oftentimes it actually won't be of a high enough resolution to use. But having said that, on Google Images as well as on Flickr, there are Creative Commons images which are usable as long as you add the appropriate copyright. One thing that I would say about an image, though, is that getting it wrong can be fatal, and that you should think very carefully about what images you're including. Don't just put a generic picture in that doesn't mean anything. Just think through what your brief is about, what image it might require, because so a lot of the briefs that I keep seeing do tend to have been using very generic images. They might be bold and vibrant, but they don't relate possibly to the topic of the brief. Here's an example of the use of images. Graphs and infographics and stuff I'm not going to go into too much, because obviously you've had that session with Jeff, but they're a way to present information in a memorable way. They might put the problem or issue that you're articulating into a broader context, and they might actually summarize something that would be far too long to summarize in text form. It's also nice to mix the use of graphs and charts with words, because your users will naturally gravitate to different forms of information. Some are more kind of like the written form better, some will understand things or understand the trend that you're trying to convey with the graph a lot more easily. Text boxes, they're a chance to tell stories that maybe don't relate directly to the text, like they illustrate it, but they're not part of the flow of the actual written policy brief. They're useful to call attention to a bulleted list as well, so they don't just have to be used to tell stories or to insert quotes. And they're a good place to add extra information. So you might use a text box at the end to point people to other resources or other websites. You can also use text boxes, as the IDS brief has used, to define some key terms. So they're also useful for that. Here are some examples. Again, this is the social protection brief. This text box has been used to put a definition in. The other thing that can be used that is a good design element is the pull-out quote or the sidebar. They're usually a quote, well, they are a quote that is in your policy brief that's literally pulled out. They're used to reiterate a key point or message and can be placed in the middle of the text if you want, or pulled to the sidebar. And I'll show you some examples of those. You can see on the right, that's a pull quote. You can see on the left, down at the bottom where the Help Age International logo is, you can see that the sidebar has been used to put key information. So that brings us to the end of the content and the look and feel of policy briefs. Are there any quick questions before I finish the presentation and then just talk you through the assignment? Okay. So what I would say, and again, I'm not going to labour this point because I know that Kike has already gone through the range of communication channels that you can use to get messages across. But ultimately, a policy brief is just a bit of paper. So no matter how long you've laboured over articulating your recommendations and laboured over putting it together, it's not going to get out there unless you've got an idea of how that's going to happen. And in terms of the key elements of a communication strategy, of course, include understanding your audience, which it sounds like you've already done, some of the stakeholder mapping, but also articulating your key messages, and then articulating the channels through which you're going to get those messages out. So is it going to be just by getting this paper printed and mailing it to people? Is it going to be by sending it as a email alert? Is the email alert going to be timed to coincide with a particular event or a particular day in the international calendar, for example, World AIDS Day? You need to think about all those things when you're trying to get your policy brief out there. So keep that in the back of your mind and do have discussions about that when you get to the end of developing the brief. I'll give you a very quick example of the need for a sort of a broader communication strategy. Back in 2002, the Humanitarian Policy Group, which is part of ODI, tended to like to produce very heavy, dense reports. Briefs were just, policy briefs or briefing papers as they call them, were just starting to be thought about. There was one particular piece of research on cash and vouchers, on using cash as opposed to food assistance in emergencies, that we were wanting to get picked up a little bit more. Instead of, so what we did is we distilled the key messages. We produced a policy brief. That policy brief was emailed to our mailing list. It was also emailed to key cash and vouchers networks who were already champions of the cause, to help them with their advocacy. And a series of international events were also hosted using that policy brief as the basis. And what the process of developing that policy brief did was to make us very clearly articulate the key messages and what we were recommending. So it's quite a good process to go through because it has all the elements. It really makes you think about what change you want to affect. Linked to making changes, I do want to underscore the importance of entry points. Keep your recommendations as direct as you can. Don't make them vague, and include entry points if you possibly can. So if you're recommending a change, try and articulate the steps that you would follow in order to make that change. And finally, your assignment, and I appreciate that this has been a very, very long session, and now I'm giving you more work to do. But as I said, your regional evidence papers, I think they're already destined to become policy briefs over the coming weeks and months. This assignment, I hope, will help you to do this. So your task over the next few weeks is to develop a 4-page policy brief. I'd like you to start by developing a set of key implications or recommendations, like I said, that draw from the regional evidence papers. Remember to make them tailored to your target audience and as specific as possible. Then I'd like you to write the executive summary or statement for your paper. Remember to include all the standard elements, your aim, problem, your methodology, if that's appropriate, results, and the implications recommendations as part of that. If you've already developed those recommendations, then that section should be relatively straightforward. Note that this section should be no more than 200 words. Then choose 3 key elements that will help highlight your evidence. It might be a graph or a box or a pull-out quote or some information in the sidebar. Please don't use an infographic because I know that you've got another assignment that involves developing one of those. Those 3 things will be due by the 22nd of January. Now, I know that I said to write the executive summary last when I was giving you advice, but if you could try and develop it, then I can certainly give you feedback on it. Given that you're synthesizing a larger report, this shouldn't be too big of an ask. And finally, by the 1st of February, we'd like you to complete your policy brief using the suggested structure provided. Now that might be the one in my presentation or the guide that Andrea has developed. And if possible, include 1 or 2 entry points as part of your recommendations, if you can. That is the end of my session. I'm keen to invite questions, or if you've been holding your question over previous sections, please ask it now. And if you've got any questions about the assignment as well, now's the time to ask.
Just to clarify something about the assignment, Carolina. The due date, yes, definitely the 1st of February. But I know that the 22nd of January can be a little bit too soon for some. So this is, if you want feedback before you develop your final brief, then do that. The deadline, that's the one that's definite, is the 1st of February for the full policy brief. And also, if you want to use then for your final policy brief more than 3 key elements, that's fine. We leave that up to you to decide what will be the best way. And also, 4 pages, it can be a little bit more if you want. That's the suggestion for a good number of pages, but it can be a little bit more, a little bit less. Also, they can be written either in Spanish or English.
Perfect. That's fine, and that's well noted then. So your papers are due definitely on the 1st of February for feedback from me. But if you want to get some feedback before that on the different elements, then feel free to send that before the 1st of February. And that 22nd of January isn't a firm deadline then. I'm happy to look at things over the course of the next few weeks.
And sorry, one more thing. Please, when you send your policy briefs, send them to Carolina, Enrique, and me. Copy the 3 of us so we can all give you feedback. It's mainly Carolina, but we also need to keep tabs on the other perspective and the feedback.
Brilliant. And my email's just on the front of my presentation. Sorry. There you go. Bottom right is where you should send it. Are there any other questions on any of the sections that I've covered? Okay, anything coming through on YouTube, Kike?
I think we've lost Kike.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so I'll close then. What I would say is the way to get good at developing policy briefs is, I guess, the way that you get good at anything is to just practice, practice, practice. For me now, you know, getting a sense of what the structure and composition of a particular brief might be is a lot easier than what it was 10 years ago. But hopefully the elements that I've described and the examples that I've given you and the design tricks that I've outlined will help you when you're trying to synthesize your REPs down to between 4 and 8 pages. But yeah, I invite you to send first drafts of your different summary boxes or your recommendations. I'm happy to comment on them. And if you've got any questions that pop into your head following this session that you forgot to ask, then please feel free to email me as well. Okay, I will bring this session to a close then, and or hand back to Kike in case he has anything else to say.
Thank you, Carolina. I managed to get myself reconnected on time. So thank you very much for that. As Carolina said, we can follow up online if you have any questions for us. If you'd like more information, just let us know. And also, of course, engage with Andrea, and we can coordinate any responses to you. The video will be ready for you to watch in the YouTube link we send you soon after this is over. You can watch it now if you want to. So if you want to go back to any section, do so. You've got the presentation. If since Carolina made some changes, might make some changes to it based on going over it now. We'll send you a new one as soon as we have it. And that's it. That's it from us. We'll certainly I'll see you in Lima for the workshop.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Andrea, you want to say something?
Yes, I'll upload the presentation slides and any follow-up resources. And if you have any questions while doing it, you can also post it on the Learning Alliance, so we can all see and learn from your questions.
Okay. So I'll stop broadcasting now, and have a good evening or a good day.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.